part of this is, I think, confusing because I think a lot of people think this is a safety conversation. But Brandon is a lawyer. I used to own a trucking company, drove years before that. And really, what I wanted to focus on was how to be viable as a carrier. It's not saving the world through safety in this conversation. So a lot of it's about just remaining viable in your business. So being able to renew your insurance premiums, make sure you keep a good safety rating so you're not unsat. So really that's the goal of this. So if you came here to like save the world through safety, it's the wrong conversation, but we're close. So
Yeah, so yeah, it's a little tough because we're used to speaking mostly to mainly to the carriers about DOT compliance, but obviously these rules that we're going to talk about, they impact not just carriers, they impact drivers and they impact them in different ways. So we're going to try and make this presentation equally applicable to both groups, both carriers and drivers as we go along. If you have any questions on any of these topics that we're talking about, just raise your hand, throw it out there, and we'll try and get to it. So here we go. You want to take this one, Rob?
Yep. So part of the reason that compliance matters, this is the safety compliance piece, is compliance isn't just about safety, it's also about staying in business. So you have ratings that we're going to go over in this, and you have SMS scores, and you have all this data that's coming from FMCSA. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all going to culminate in higher premiums or lower premiums, or are you able to stay in business with the score that you have, how you're operating. So in 2023, transportation incidents were the leading cause of workplace deaths. So obviously the safety side. Truck driver fatalities dropped 11.9%, showing that safety technology and compliance measures work. And then compliance determines whether you get insured, secure freight, and stay operational. So part of this is your scores are dictating whether your premium is going to be high or if it's going to be low, if you can get insurance or not, and whether you're going to be able to stay in business through your rating. But then there's also, are shippers and brokers going to work with you based on your historical performance from a safety perspective? So there's a lot that goes into this, and that's really what we wanted to focus on.
Yeah, and there's a lot. Yeah, go ahead. Go for it. Yeah. Yeah, so the question's about FMCSA's CSA scores and whether the agency has done anything to kind of level the playing field, because you mentioned that you're a small trucking company, but the system is pulling in data from the 800,000 plus trucking companies that are operating in the country. Some of them have thousands of units and many more of them have 1 to 10 units. And so, yeah, I mean, to answer your question, the FMCSA is currently in the process of completely overhauling the way that they calculate your scores. They haven't yet. So that system has been in place since 2010. So it's 15 years old, and they haven't made any substantial changes to it since that time. But they have recently proposed pretty substantial changes to it. I just did a 2-hour webinar yesterday on just those changes and what's in store. There's a preview. So if you manage the scores for your company, there's a preview website you can log on to now and see what your scores will look like once those changes take effect. We don't know when the changes will take effect, but they are messing with the methodology of how they calculate scores in several different ways. So it's worth getting on that website and seeing what your scores are going to look like under that once those changes do take effect. It's not a rulemaking, so the FMCSA does a lot of things through formal rulemaking like federal agencies do, but the CSA program, for whatever reason, wasn't handled through a rulemaking, and so the changes to it aren't through a formal rulemaking either. Now, they have opened it up for public comments and stuff like that, and they've had listening sessions kind of like a rulemaking, but it's not a formal rulemaking. So we're expecting that they'll probably go live with those changes, if I had to guess, probably near the end of this year or early next year. Obviously, a complicating factor is that we're in the middle of a administration change and a lot of turnover at the agency and some staffing problems. So that doesn't help anything with the timing. But yeah, that's kind of the answer to the question. Sure. But I just kind of wrap up what Rob was saying. We don't have to tell you guys that there's a lot of targets on your back, not only from the DOT. Obviously, non-compliance with these regulations can cause you trouble with the DOT, gets you sideways with the DOT. But that's usually the least of my concerns when I look at it from the legal standpoint. Usually, there are bigger things to consider when it comes to non-compliance. As Rob mentioned, increased insurance premiums is certainly a problem that can stem from non-compliance, and also the highway accident litigation exposure that comes with not doing these things like the regulations tell you to do them. We've seen a tremendous uptick in so-called nuclear verdicts. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but these are cases where juries render verdicts in excess of $10 million against trucking companies. There was a comprehensive study done on those types of cases by an organization called the American Transportation Research Institute. They actually have a booth out near the lobby, ATRI. And they did this study, what was it, Rob, probably 5-6 years ago on these cases and what leads to these types of cases with multi-million-dollar verdicts against trucking companies and their drivers. And they found, first of all, that the number of these cases over the last 10 years has risen by 1,000%. The number of jury verdicts in excess of $10 million against trucking companies up over 1,000% over the last 10 years. And then also the size of the verdicts is on that trajectory as well. We just, a couple years ago, we saw the first ever $1 billion jury verdict rendered in our industry against a couple of trucking companies in Florida. Is anybody ever going to collect $1 billion? No. But the point is, the dollar value of these cases is going up, tremendously. And so the point here is that, it's easy to get caught up in making sure we do things right to avoid roadside enforcement and that type of stuff, but that's usually the least of our concerns when we look at it. So,
yeah. All right, the bigger picture, obviously, is part of it's protecting lives. I mean, a lot of people are going to tell you my number one goal is safety. And one of the things that I think we always give out is that's really not good to put in writing, because really, if you were ultimately focused on safety and your number one goal was keeping everyone alive and safe, you wouldn't put any trucks on the road. So ultimately, safety is a priority. It is one of your goals. It should be one of your goals. But spelling out that it is our ultimate goal is probably not the best position to take. But safety is ultimately is not only about regulations. It's about real people. Protecting your drivers, your business, and the motoring public is the end goal. Fleets that focus on safety and compliance maintain public trust and long-term viability. And one of the big aspects of this is if you're working with a broker and you get to the point of a conditional rating, you're probably not going to be doing very much more work for that broker. Some businesses, Walt Disney is a good one, for example, if you don't have a satisfactory rating, you won't be hauling any freight for them at all, which is in some cases difficult because not everyone has safety ratings. I don't know, what are we at?
I think 95% of the carriers in the country don't have a safety rating.
So spoiling it even worse by making yourself conditional is a problem. Ignoring compliance leads to higher insurance costs, lost contracts, and FMCSA scrutiny. And the compliance cost isn't just associated with high fines. It's the scrutiny of ISS scores, which are going to get you pulled into the scale more often, which is this vicious cycle of just constantly getting more violations, more inspections, etc. So it's not just about the safety aspect. There's a lot of this that goes to actually keeping you in business. So that's the big takeaway from this.
So Rob mentioned the safety ratings. For those that aren't familiar with this, so this is a rating system that the FMCSA has had in place for decades at this point. This is more applicable to carriers. This is a topic that would be more applicable to carriers than to drivers, but it's important nonetheless because it's a topic that comes up all the time in all of these contexts that we've talked about: highway accident litigation, certainly FMCSA audits, and also brokers and shippers are looking at these things. So it's important you understand at least kind of conceptually what these safety ratings are. So FMCSA has a 3-tier rating system currently for the 800,000 plus carriers that they regulate. This is a rating system that requires a DOT audit, and this is why we only have about 5% of the regulated carriers that have a safety rating, because only about 5% of that universe of carriers have actually undergone a comprehensive DOT audit. Nowadays, when a new carrier registers for an interstate DOT number, we have what's called a new entrant safety audit. That all of those carriers have to go through when they get the DOT number for the first time, but those are very cursory audits. Those are not comprehensive audits, the type that would render a safety rating if the DOT were to come in and do a comprehensive one. Comprehensive one is when they're coming in and looking in depth at your compliance records, driver qualification files, hours of service logs, vehicle maintenance records, accident files, all of that, drug and alcohol testing, all of that type of stuff. And the point is, if the FMCSA ever does that for carriers, they come in, they're looking at all of those files. There's a whole methodology that goes to how they end up calculating these ratings. And so if you're a carrier that has been through one of those audits, then you're a carrier that probably has one of these 3 ratings. It's satisfactory, conditional, or unsatisfactory. These are publicly available for anybody to look up. You can go to the FMCSA's website, type in a DOT number or the name of the motor carrier, and you can see if they have a safety rating or not. And as we've already kind of hit on, these safety ratings are important for many reasons, not the least of which a lot of shippers and brokers have that built into their contracts that, hey, you either have to have no rating at all or you have to have a satisfactory rating. If you have a conditional or an unsatisfactory rating, we're not doing business with you. And the reason you'll see that in a lot of contracts is because those shippers and the brokers, they have skin in the game, right? If they hire you as a carrier and you have a conditional rating and then one of your drivers goes and kills somebody, your insurance, assuming you've got the minimum level of insurance, is going to be quickly exhausted in that litigation. And so the plaintiff's attorneys are going to look for the deeper pockets. That is kind of their MO, right? They're going to look up the chain for the deeper pockets. Who has the deeper pockets in these relationships? It's the shippers and the brokers. And so what we're seeing more and more of are brokers and shippers getting pulled into these litigation, and they are being held responsible in some cases, in some jurisdictions, for the damages in those cases. And so for that reason, because they have that skin in the game, you are seeing more and more brokers and shippers really kind of tightening their belt when it comes to what level of risk they're willing to accept when it comes to hiring motor carriers. So safety ratings play a big role in that. And you can see here, I mean, looking at this from a DOT side of things, satisfactory is obviously the rating carriers want to shoot for in an audit. It's the highest rating available. Unsatisfactory on the other end of the scale. If you're a motor carrier and you get an unsatisfactory rating coming out of an audit, your entire fleet is going to get shut down by the DOT. And this happens all the time. Thousands of carriers get completely shut down after failing a compliance review and getting an unsatisfactory rating out of that. The middle ground there is a conditional rating, which essentially the DOT says you can continue operating with a conditional safety rating, but it means they found systemic problems with your compliance in that review. And it's those conditional ratings where we tend to see shippers and brokers having some trouble, having some heartburn about using carriers. Because if you got an unsatisfactory rating, obviously your trucks can't drive. So obviously shippers and brokers can't use you if you got an unsat rating. But the conditional ratings, we're even starting to see shippers and brokers saying, hey, that's too risky. We're not going to do business with you. So
Yeah, we actually had a carrier recently. We talk about two different situations. One was a conditional rating. They called us for an upgrade, and that's because they haul oil and gas in Texas. And they basically weren't shut down with a conditional rating. They got a fine. They paid the fine immediately. But then there was the aspect of the people they haul oil and gas for did not want to do business with them anymore. So until they got that conditional rating upgraded to either an unrated or a satisfactory, they were essentially closed, or they had to find someone else that would let them haul their freight with a conditional rating. So even the conditional rating, even though you're not closed, it may, in essence, be a death sentence if you can't find somebody to haul that's going to let you haul their freight.
Yeah, and for the drivers in here, just to illustrate, because I don't think it feels real to a lot of drivers because they just don't, drivers don't have safety ratings.
Right.
And so they only hear about it from their carrier. But here's how quickly your activity out on the roads can end up with your carrier having a conditional safety rating. One of the things that they look at in most of these audits are hours of service logs, as you would expect. And usually when the DOT is coming in to audit logs, they're picking a sample of logs to look at. And they are usually, the sample size depends on the size of the fleet, the number of drivers that are operating for that fleet. But all it takes in a DOT compliance review to end up with a conditional rating, just to give you a sense of and make this feel more real for you, is a 10% violation rate in the hours of service factor. So if they are looking at 100 on-duty days worth of logs for a carrier, just to make the math easy here, all they would have to find are 10 log falsifications, for example, and that carrier ends up with a conditional safety rating. That is the number one contributor to conditional safety ratings now, according to FMCSA data, is log falsifications. And I can go even further than that and say that the number one contributor to log falsifications is misuse of personal conveyance status. The data bears that out, that drivers and carriers not understanding how to, or what circumstances really warrant personal conveyance status, that is leading to a ton of conditional safety ratings. And it just doesn't take a whole lot to end up potentially shutting that carrier down when it comes to logs specifically.
Yeah, and when you get these ratings, there is a process to go through it. So just thinking, hey, I've got an unsat. We recently had one. We do a lot of these for big, medium, and small carriers, but this was 120 trucks up in Indiana, and the business completely closed that day. So that's 120 drivers out of work. Do you think they're going to stick around for 3 to 4 months while we get your safety rating upgraded with no work? You're going to have to restart that business from scratch. You're going to have to hire new drivers. You're going to have to basically do it all again. That's if you can survive 3-4 months with no revenue. So for me, as somebody who started as a driver and then became a fleet owner, a lot of times I would look at things, you can still look up my record now. The first year I had a $10,000 fine for hours of service. The second year they came back and gave me a $20,000 because I was doing the same thing again. I looked at it like it was the cost of doing business. And then obviously when I sold my business, that hurt financially because they did their due diligence. So it hurt me when I sold my business, but it hurt me as I operated my business as well, because there were people that would not do business with me as a carrier. But my mindset was on operational. Hey, my wheels have to turn. It's the cost of doing business. But actually, if you look at it with the bigger mindset, more open-minded mindset, it can be catastrophic for your business to where you can make no money at all.
I don't think you disclosed those things to me when you applied to work.
Yeah. In a way, they have a score because they have PSP. So I think if you go to a carrier, I would say, I'm going to guess 40% of our carriers do PSP. It's not a lot. But I can say this, I've looked at a driver who had a perfect MVR, looked like a model employee, had a good VOE from the previous employer, and then you pull a PSP and it's 4 pages long. Tires, lights, hours of service violations, but those aren't convictions in court. So if you pull it on an MVR, you're not seeing that. So you're not really getting the big picture of, is this a good driver or not? You're just getting a clean MVR. So unless you pull that PSP, you're not seeing that score for the driver.
And keep in mind, so FMCSA, when they originally came out with the CSA scoring platform, they had originally proposed to do an actual driver score. It was going to be called the Driver Safety Measurement System. But they ended up not going forward with that. So drivers don't have a true score. The only thing they have are the PSP, the pre-employment screening program, which is a voluntary program. If you're a carrier, you don't have to use the PSP, but it gives you a good picture of the driver's violation history.
Yeah.
But yeah, the FMCSA itself does not score drivers. There are other platforms out there that some ELD systems have like driver scorecards and stuff like that. But when it comes to the FMCSA itself, not scoring drivers currently, and no talks of them doing that anytime soon. So,
all right, FMCSA safety rating system. Obviously, we just discussed the 3 different ratings, but the cost of an unconditional safety rating or a conditional safety rating, we also touched on. You're talking higher insurance premiums, and one of the things that happens when you go to renew your insurance, there's a marketing arm of your insurance broker that has to try to sell you as a carrier to an insurance company. So they may go to market and find 10 that they like, that they try to get you insured through. They may end up with 2 offers, and then maybe only 1 accepts you. So that premium is going to be dictated by how well they can sell your business and market it to an insurance carrier. So it's important from that aspect to keep your record clean, because a huge part of that marketing aspect is your safety history, cab report, etc.
Safety measurements. So moving on from safety ratings, obviously an important metric, but another, and we've kind of already hit on this one, but another crucial metric for fleets and their drivers, more so fleets again, to watch is the safety measurement system, sometimes colloquially called CSA scores. This is the scoring platform that the FMCSA came out with in 2010 that they are working on some revisions to. But this is the system whenever you're driving down the road, or your drivers are driving down the road and they get stopped for a roadside inspection at a weigh station or whatever, and they get written up for violations, whether it be something wrong with the vehicle or something wrong with the driver's credentials or their logs. All of those violations get written up on a standardized report that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And those violations are going somewhere, whether you know it or not. They are going to, does that mean we're done?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's go.
They are landing on the motor carrier's safety measurement system and account. And that safety measurement system is essentially generating scores in 7 categories. They're listed up here. And it's these scores that end up driving the FMCSA's enforcement program. So if you know anything about FMCSA, you probably know that they are a relatively small agency as federal agencies go. I think I was at the FMCSA session this morning. They said they've got about 1,000 employees. Those 1,000 employees are responsible for enforcing these regulations against 800,000 trucking companies and 5 million CDL drivers in the U.S. And so what that means is that, practically speaking, the FMCSA just does not have the manpower to effectively enforce these regulations against any significant number of the carriers that they regulate, even with their relationships with state law enforcement. So they have to devise a way to prioritize the worst motor carriers that are going to get their attention. And so the way that they do that primarily now is through the safety measurement system. So as your drivers and as your trucks are getting stopped and written up for violations, that's jacking up your CSA scores. And then it's the carriers that have the highest CSA scores that are going to get the knock at the door from the FMCSA for an audit, and potentially all of those consequences that we've already discussed. So that's the real world impact of those roadside violations and it doesn't take a lot of them to jack up your CSA scores, and particularly in some of these categories like hours of service compliance. And so, just a few, if you're a sizable fleet, just a few new hours of service violations in a particular month could end up with you getting a big old warning triangle on your hours of service score. And those warning triangles are what the FMCSA uses to say, hey, that's a carrier we need to go visit because the system is telling us that there are some systemic non-compliance issues. So that's safety measurement system in a nutshell.
Yeah, and essentially one of the things to think about when you're getting these violations, just hours of service 1 is double weighted, and let's just focus on that piece. So if you get an 8-point violation and then an out of service on top of that, you may end up with 12 points there, and that's going to affect your hours of service rating and put you into an alert status possibly over time and hours of service, which is going to end in possibly some kind of enforcement action. But one of the other things it's going to do, and I think it's probably the next slide, if it's not, we're going to talk about it anyway, it's going to basically push you, there's an ISS score, and what happens with your ISS score is the worse you behave historically, the higher your ISS score is generally going to get. So the closer you get to 0, the better you are. The higher you get to 100, the worse it's going to be. I think it's anything over 75, you don't get an option for an inspection. Anything below maybe 50, it's basically you're good.
And we hear this a lot. I mean, and I understand it, but a lot of carriers and drivers think, hey, I'm being targeted for some reason by this officer. He doesn't like me, so he's pulling me over just to screw with me. Well, usually in most cases, what we find is we say to that carrier, well, what's your inspection selection system score, your ISS score? Because that is the system that drives whether your trucks are going to get stopped or not. I mean, not all the time. If an officer, even if you got a really low ISS score, if an officer sees you have a flat tire, you're going to get pulled over and you're going to get inspected. But all else equal, it's the carriers that have a high ISS score that are going to be the ones that get pulled over in a weigh station for a roadside inspection. And so if you feel like you are getting targeted, you should look at what your ISS score is. It's probably in the mandatory inspect category, which means that the law enforcement has no discretion but to stop your trucks for inspections because of your ISS score. And how do you get ISS scores? As Rob mentioned, your ISS scores are tied to your safety measurement system scores as well. So it's essentially being driven by the roadside violations that your drivers are incurring roadside.
But how these metrics ultimately are going to affect you is when you get into a place where they feel you need enforcement and they need to focus on you, you're generally going to get a warning letter first saying, hey, we've noticed that your maintenance scores are starting to creep up. You need to correct this, or we're probably going to come visit you and actually do a focused or full compliance review. And then obviously the next part is a compliance review, on-site review of your entire system. So basically, that's where they're going to come out, look at everything, and you may end up with a fine, you may end up with a rating. It's just going to depend on if that's a focused or if it's going to be a full compliance review. So once you're flagged, that becomes an issue. So when you go for insurance, another important consideration with this is, we already talked about what they look at, but also on that cab report, when you go for insurance renewal, they're going to see what's on the back end of FMCSA. So what's not public to everybody is where you're in alert status and what your ISS score is. But on that information and those metrics that go to insurance companies for renewal, it's on there. So they're going to know that you're in alert status and maintenance and hours of service, and that your ISS score is a 99. So that's going to cause you problems at renewal. Maybe you get insurance, but maybe it's $30,000 a truck, which means you probably can't afford to operate. So it all culminates in basically doing the right thing so that you can stay in business and continue to make money.
FMCSA, so moving on then from scores and the various metrics that we look at, then the obvious question then is, what do we do to get control of these things? Whether I'm a driver or whether I'm a motor carrier, what can I do once my metrics escalate beyond a point where I'm starting to get warning letters and stuff like that? Well, there are a few things that you can do. Obviously, the best thing is to not incur those types of violations going forward. That's really the only way you organically improve your scores over time, is to have your old violations fall off and you incur no new ones or less weightier ones going forward. But putting that to the side, there are a couple of things that are tools that are available to you as a carrier and as a driver to potentially improve your scores if you're a carrier, or your PSP report if you're a driver, one of which is called the FMCSA's Crash Preventability Determination Program. This was a program that was set up probably 5 or 6 years ago. And if you know anything about FMCSA scoring and how they handle accidents, for many years the FMCSA has taken into consideration, they have pulled into their SMS system all DOT recordable crashes that a motor carrier has incurred, regardless of whose fault they were. So, as you saw in the slide, one of the 7 basics that gets scored in the safety measurement system is called crash indicator. So that crash indicator score is being influenced by any DOT recordable accident that carrier and its drivers have incurred, regardless of whether it was that carrier's or that driver's fault or not. So if I'm a commercial driver and I'm sitting at a stoplight and I get rear-ended and it's a serious accident and the vehicle has to be towed away from the scene, that score is going to impact that carrier's crash indicator score, even though there was nothing our driver could have done to fix it. And obviously that doesn't seem very fair, and it's not very fair. But that has been historically how the system has treated accidents. And I think the I'm not an FMCSA apologist, but if I had to guess, I think the rationale for that approach was, hey, at least we're treating every motor carrier the same way. We're holding all of these accidents, we're holding all carriers accountable for all accidents regardless of fault. Well, plenty of people complained about the way that was handled over the years. And so FMCSA, like I said, 5 or 6 years ago, they stood up this new program, Crash Preventability Determination Program. This is a program you can use to challenge the preventability of the accidents that are landing on your SMS scores if you're a carrier or your PSP account if you're a driver. Now, the problem with the program, many problems with the program, but one of the main problems with the program is that it's fairly limited in scope in terms of the types of accidents that qualify for potential review under the program. Remember, I said FMCSA is a short-staffed agency. They do not have enough folks to be able to review the preventability of any significant number of accidents each year. So they had to tighten their focus on the ones that are easy for somebody at the agency to determine whether it's preventable or not. And they do that by limiting the types of crashes that are eligible for consideration in the program. And we've got some of them listed here. There's a whole eligibility guide that the FMCSA has published that if your accident is of type that fits into one of those criteria, then you can go in and say, hey, listen, my driver wasn't at fault, and if you get the agency to agree with you, then that accident will no longer impact your scores, your crash indicator score. Question, yep. No, you're good. Questions about dash cams or inward facing, outward facing, how this influences. It actually will influence this program more heavily here in the next couple of months. So I'm talking about the eligibility guide here and what types of accidents are eligible for consideration, and it's been fairly limited. And so that means that a large swath of your accidents aren't going to be eligible for consideration under the program. But what recently changed with this is that the FMCSA, within the last couple of months, they added some new accident types that are going to be eligible for consideration under this program that you can submit and have the agency determine whether they were preventable on your driver's part or not. And one of the new crashes that's eligible, I think the way they have worded it is any other accident in which an event recorder, a camera device, clearly shows the sequence of events. That has historically not been an option under this program. And so if you have event recorders installed in your trucks, and those event recorders make it clear that it was not your driver's fault in the accident, going forward, once they implement those changes, they haven't implemented them yet, but once they implement those changes, you'll be able to submit the video file to prove the sequence of events and hopefully get that accident taken off your account. So that's how cameras will play into it in the future. Yep. You probably have a better pulse on how insurance companies are reacting to the installation of these types of events.
Well, a lot of insurance companies are going to, you will have them or you won't be insured by us. So whether it's, I do a lot of work for Gallagher Bassett, Captive Groups, Epic, Reliance, and almost all of them are in talks or already have said you need to have cameras in your vehicles if you want insurance through us. So sometimes they build
mainly forward facing, right?
Yeah. And there's the whole debate. We could spend all day in here with drivers out front talking about the privacy aspects of dual-facing cameras. But in terms of all the ones that I file in terms of crash, basically determining the preventability of a crash, we've had some lose even with camera evidence. So you can still, even if it doesn't fall in that category, submit photos, camera evidence, anything you want. I mean, I've submitted everything down to the Indiana State Driver's License Handbook as evidence on why we weren't responsible or why our client wasn't responsible for this crash. So cameras, I think, play an important role, but it's not always like a get-out-of-jail-free card. So
Just to give you a sense, because I always find this hilarious, so I have to say it at every talk I give on this topic, but to give you a sense of the type of accidents that the FMCSA deems eligible for consideration under this program, literally one of the listed items of eligible crashes is if your commercial motor vehicle is struck by a skydiver that has fallen out of the sky. That is literally one of the listed examples of accidents that you could challenge if that ever happens to your fleet under this program. But there are obviously some others, and we've got them listed here. So, we recommend all carriers and all drivers make sure you understand that this program exists and make sure you use it to your advantage. Because if you're just letting those accidents sit on your account, again, whether you're a carrier or a driver, they are impacting you. As a carrier, they are jacking up your crash indicator score. As a driver, they are landing on your PSP report and potentially impacting your ability to get work going, if you go to a new carrier. So use this program if you can, leverage it, get these accidents taken off your account.
And we're getting ready to go into data queues, but a good point here is when you know you're coming up for renewal is not a surprise. You know in 6 months your renewal is coming up. It's, for me, usually part of a marketing plan with an insurance carrier before they put yours to market is to actually make sure that do you have crashes on there that you can do this for, which will help your premium and that marketing campaign. But then there's also, are all these violations yours, and are there any that you can data queue to get knocked off there for the purpose of marketing to make you look better?
Yeah. The question is essentially about, if we're a carrier, how do we handle situations where drivers have been involved in preventable accidents or get written up for a violation that was clearly their fault? Maybe they missed something on the pre-trip inspection or something like that. And there are various ways to handle it. Different carriers handle it different ways. A lot of, fleets with company drivers will have some kind of a progressive disciplinary policy where they incorporate things like you mentioned, like, maybe first time will be a written warning, second time we'll do some retraining on the types of issues that led to the violation, some kind of a corrective action plan of here's what we're doing. And those are important. They are important for many different reasons, one of which is insurance renewal. Insurance companies like to see that you have mechanisms in place to not only address the issues that you're encountering from a compliance standpoint, but documenting those things. Because the other area where documenting the steps you've taken to address the admitted violations and the admitted preventable accidents is in a DOT audit. If you, God forbid, DOT comes in and audits and you end up with a downgraded safety rating for the reasons we've already mentioned, one of the ways you get that upgraded so that you don't suffer the consequences of that downgraded rating is by submitting what's called a corrective action plan to the DOT and essentially begging them for mercy based on your documented attempts to fix the problems. And if you've gone along all this time without documenting what actions you've taken to counsel the drivers on the issues or to prevent that type of accident from reoccurring, you're not going to have anything to submit to the DOT and try and get that rating upgraded. So they're important for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, not just those, but when you're trying to file data queues, obviously document retention is good because you're going to need some evidence to submit for data queue violations. I mean, they don't just take them off. So it's anytime you can put something in place and then document everything, it's good.
So data queue, we talked about crash preventability. Data queue is kind of the sister of the crash preventability demonstration program in the sense that it is if you're not familiar with it, it's the program that exists for motor carriers and for drivers to challenge violations that they think are erroneous for one reason or another. And the system has been in place since CSA has been in place since 2010. plenty of problems with the system. If you've ever used the system, you're painfully familiar with these problems with it. But it is what it is. It's valuable in cases where it's clear that the law enforcement officer or the FMCSA got something wrong when they cited you for a violation, whether it be in a roadside inspection or in a compliance review. If you think the officer got something wrong and you've got evidence to back up your case, then you should file a data queue challenge. It's a simple process. It's all done online. You don't have to go to a court to do it, although there is we'll talk about that in a second. But you file these online, you submit whatever evidence you have, you upload it, and if you can get the state to agree that their officer was wrong, then that violation will come off your scores, and your scores will improve that way. One of the biggest problems, or one of the biggest challenges with the data queue system is that the agency that reviews your data queues challenges is not the FMCSA, as you would hope it would be. Who is it that reviews your data queues challenges to violations? It's the very same law enforcement agency that wrote you up for the violation to begin with. So if you're challenging a violation written up by the Indiana State Police for something, it's going to be the Indiana State Police that rule on your challenge, and theirs is going to be the final word on it. And so you can imagine, as a lawyer, that pains me, because where's the due process in that, right? It's the same agency that wrote the violation. How inclined are they going to be to change their mind on something based on your complaining about it? And so what we find is that the success rate on data queues challenges is pretty abysmal. But it's not impossible to win a data queues challenge. And when you've got evidence, good evidence to back up your case of why you think the officer got it wrong, particularly, I think the best use case of data queues system is instances when the officer has misinterpreted the rule. And it happens all the time, because then it's not a he said, she said thing. You're not pitting your driver's word up against the officer's. I can tell you, if it's just your driver's word against the officer's word, you're going to lose that battle 99% of the time. But if it's a situation where the officer has misinterpreted a rule, maybe your driver was short haul exempt on a particular day and they wrote him up for a logging violation, and you can prove that the short haul exemption applied, that's a good use case of the data queue system to go in there and say, hey, my driver was exempt under the regulations, and here's why. Here's his time card or whatever you got to prove he was short haul exempt. Then you stand a much better chance of getting those types of violations taken off. So that's how I would use data queues.
Another good use of this system is if you have a driver who is given a ticket along with the violation, and then he goes to court, fights the ticket, beats it or gets it reduced, you can file a data queue based on the adjudication of the court. So a lot of times that's one of the ways to get these knocked off. The problem with that is a lot of people in enforcement, especially in Indiana, where Brandon is from, are not giving tickets. They're just giving the violation. So there isn't a court involved, which makes it more difficult. So in those cases, there's really nothing you can do about it except data queue and ask for, the proverbial mercy.
Yeah, and I've got no specific beef with law enforcement, but they know what they're doing when they do that. It seems counterintuitive to say you're better off to get a ticket. But that is the case under this system. Your driver is better off to get a citation with the violation, because the way that the data queue system is set up, if they go fight it in court, now they've got somebody independent reviewing their case. It's not the same agency anymore that's serving as the judge. They've got an independent set of eyes on the case, and if they've got a good argument that the officer got it wrong, then they stand a better chance of winning at the state court level. And even if they don't win and get the violation dismissed completely, a lot of times you can work with the traffic prosecutor and you can get the charge reduced to something different. And the way that the data queue system is currently set up, if you can convince a court to dismiss the violation entirely, you can go submit an adjudicated citations data queue challenge for that violation and say, look, this court dismissed it. And at that point, the state has no discretion anymore but to remove that violation completely from your scores. And so if you got the court to agree with you and dismiss it, you're in a good position. And even if you didn't get them to dismiss it entirely, if you can get the prosecutor to agree to a lesser charge, you can go in then and provide proof of that in the data queue system, and the severity weight for that violation has to get knocked down to 1. So if it was a heavily weighted violation, 10-pointer, and you got it reduced to something lesser in the state court and you file this data queue, it will come down to a severity weight of 1 on your scores. So it has the potential to significantly improve your scores with those adjudicated citations challenges.
Basically the final takeaway is compliance is your competitive advantage, and I think we've kind of made the point here that you're not gonna save the world with safety today, but ultimately you might keep yourself in business, you might keep yourself self-insured, you may keep the same set of brokers or shipper clients by basically fixing violations before they cost you your contracts and insurance, using data queues and crash preventability determination program to basically battle these out before you go up for renewal or before they sabotage your scores. But ultimately, it all boils down to proactive compliance. And I think a lot of people look at compliance like it's a necessary evil, and in some ways it is, but in other ways it's what's ultimately keeping you in business. So it's just something to consider, and it's another way to look at this rather than just kind of looking at it like it's the evil.
Yeah, and a good way to be, we'll come back here in a second, but a good way to be proactive, as Rob mentioned, and shameless plug for us. I mean, this is pretty much the only things that Rob and I talk about. And so at TruckSafe, we push out a lot of free content on all of these topics: how best to file a data queue, how to use the crash preventability program, and everything in between, how audits are conducted. And so if you're interested in kind of learning more about that and keeping up to speed about what's going on with DOT regulations, I recommend you follow us. We're all over the place. We've got LinkedIn if you want to connect with us there. We've got a newsletter through the TruckSafe website. We're on YouTube with all kinds of short videos on these topics. So we'd love to have you there if you have any interest in following along with that type of stuff. So trucksafe.com is where you'll find that. Yeah, question? Yeah, so the question is kind of twofold. It's about, up here talking about fewer inspections. The way you get fewer inspections is by improving your ISS score. And as your ISS score improves, it lowers your chances of getting pulled over for an inspection. But to your second part of your question is this concept of volunteering for inspections to hopefully get clean ones to then drive down your scores. And we routinely have carriers ask us our opinions about that, and my opinion about it has always been that I think it's a bad idea. I don't think you should be volunteering for inspections. I think that's a bad idea. It has always been a bad idea. The chances of you getting a clean inspection are increasingly low because it is too easy for officers to find things nowadays. And so even just one minor thing now on a roadside inspection report can really jack up your scores. So for that reason, I don't recommend it. But nowadays, it's not even really a question anymore because the CVSA, Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, kind of the agency that kind of oversees all law enforcement agencies, has put out a directive, as I understand it, to all law enforcement agencies that they aren't to do voluntary inspections anymore. Yeah, so the FMCSA has said they don't pay the states to do voluntary inspections. So it's not even a thing anymore that you can get done. So kind of a moot point. But anyway, any other questions? Yep. There you go. You should attend that. 10:45 tomorrow. FMCSA is doing a session on data queue, crash preventability. What was the other one?
Clearinghouse.
Clearinghouse. Yeah, you should attend that if you're going to be around and see what they have to say about it.
Yeah, another one of our guys, Brian Reynolds, who's like the maintenance king. He's just about at every show that you can think of that goes on maintenance. He's also going to be here tomorrow talking about maintenance, basically keeping your fleet in top shape.
And I think he's also talking about the distinction between citations and violations, kind of digging into that even more detail. So anyway, any other questions? All right. Well, thanks, everybody, for joining us. Appreciate it.